So much, Lonnie and Bruce. Back in early May, I had gone to Newfoundland as part of our partnership with Mile One Mission and in conjunction with the state convention. And needless to say, to get to Newfoundland, you need to fly. And I actually went out of Charlotte. I don't do a ton of flying, but I have flown a number of times over the years. And I can't say that I love it. I can't say that I hate it. I do find it a bit aggravating, though, and this was especially aggravating, though, the whole takeoff instructions, because each leg of the flight from Charlotte to Toronto to St. John's, so I was flying Air Canada. And that was a problem because you had to listen to all the instructions twice, once in English and once in French, because Canada has two official languages. And if you've ever flown, then you are aware of this. If you've never flown, then this will be informative, I suppose, for you. It'll be fascinating. Anyway, there's a fair number of instructions that they are going to give you. And let me just say that essentially all of them are worthless. And one of the first things that they'll say is they'll talk about a seat belt. And not only will they talk about the seat belt, but they will demonstrate the proper use of a seat belt. And let me just say this. If you are capable of getting onto an airplane and through TSA and all that stuff, if you can't fasten a seat belt, I just say we let whatever is going to happen, happen. I just say we cull the herd. And if you can't figure it out, the world might be a better place. Anyway, but you have to listen, again, in French and in English about this seatbelt. You're going to listen to them talk about the possibility of oxygen masks that are going to come down from the ceiling. And they'll show you pictures of them, or in this case, a video of what this looks like. First of all, I don't really think these things are real. I think these are effectively red Solo cups with a sandwich bag hooked to them. I don't think there's actually oxygen going through them, because if you are at 30,000 feet and the oxygen masks come down, you're going to die. You just are. And they're saying stuff to you like, get a few breaths and then pass it to the person next to you. Really? I didn't want to live. I thought you'd like to breathe a little bit. But again, I'm listening to this in French and in English. As if that's not dumb enough, they start to talk to you about how your seat doubles as a flotation device. Oh, that's wonderful. My seat is a boat. No, not a boat, a flotation device. There haven't been, and we're blessed because of this, but there haven't been a million plane crashes, but we have had a fair number of plane crashes over the decades, and there have been a few instances, not a ton of them, but there have been some instances where there have been survivors. Not a ton of them, but in all of the instances where someone has survived a plane crash, can you think of one where somebody was interviewed by a news crew and they said, by God's grace and that flotation device, I'm here today? Listen, if you need a flotation device, you're going to die. You just are. You just are. But you're going to have to listen to all of this. And there's all of these lengthy instructions that you have to listen to. And again, especially if you're on a flight like that with multiple languages, you're going to hear it not once but twice. And every leg of the flight, you're going to have to hear it. And I'm just like, this is just such a colossal waste of time. Interestingly, though, when the plane lands, the instructions are far briefer, much briefer. They say things like this. In fact, typically it's the pilot that comes on and says, hey, we're going to be landing here in a few minutes. You want to get in your seat, put your seat belt on, and raise your seat trays. You know what? Everything that the pilot just said, all that stuff matters. All that stuff is pretty important, because when that plane comes in and hits the tarmac at, 200 miles an hour, whatever it is, you're going to want to be in that seat, and you're going to want to have that seatbelt on, because if it's a kind of a rough landing, you don't really want to be peeling your head off of the roof of the airplane, right? Furthermore, you want that seat tray in front of you not to be with your forehead on it, right? So you want that raised. All of these are short, simple instructions, but all of that information there at the end is of real importance. You know, it's interesting, at the end of something, it tends to be, oftentimes, that's when we're sharing some of the most important information, isn't it? Hey, but before I go, before we finish this, let me just make sure that you know this. Back at the beginning of June, actually, we started working our way through what we know as Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And I repeatedly have been driving home the point that Jesus has been unpacking this theme of kingdom, where he is the king and he has this domain of subjects, those that are following him, and he's establishing these are the norms of what kingdom living looks like. And today we're going to get to the end of this message and to the end of this series, and he's going to finish with what I believe is a really important question. And it's not to say that everything else he has said is not important, but it's of particular concern today. How do you know if you're in the kingdom? I mean, everything he has said talks about this is what kingdom living is looking like. These are the expectations. These are the norms. This is what you should experience. This is what you should expect. This is how things are supposed to operate. But how do you know if you're in or not? That's a pretty important question. In fact, that's a mightily important question. So how do you know if you're in the kingdom or not? Look with me to Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7, starting with verse 13. Matthew chapter 7, starting with verse 13. There we're told by Jesus, enter through the narrow gate. For the gate is wide and the road broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who go through it. How narrow is the gate and difficult the road that leads to life, and few find it. Be on your guard against false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravaging wolves. You'll recognize them by their fruit. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles? In the same way, every good tree produces good fruit, but a bad tree produces bad fruit. A good tree can't produce bad fruit, neither can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that doesn't produce good fruits is cut down and thrown into the fire, so you'll recognize them by their fruit. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. On that day many will say to me, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name? Didn't we drive out demons in your name and do many miracles in your name? Then I will announce to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you lawbreakers. It's an important question, one that needs to be answered, and thankfully Jesus provides the answers for us. How do you know if you're in the kingdom? Based on what he says, he gives us a couple of statements that we need to answer, and the first is this. Did you use the narrow gate that isn't crowded? Did you use the narrow gate that isn't crowded? Obviously, even that answer is linked to a metaphor that Jesus establishes starting back in verse 13, where he says, enter through the narrow gate, and he describes a narrow gate versus a broad gate, and a narrow path and a broad path or broad road. And each of these gates, a narrow gate and a broad gate, leads to a road or leads to a path, and both of them have different destinations. He says that there is this gate that is wide and this gate that is broad, and he says it leads to destruction. By contrast, he says that there is this narrow gate and the road is difficult and it leads to life. Let me just say very simply that it is this narrow gate and it is this narrow road, it is this difficult road that leads to experience or to the experience of life as a part of God's kingdom. Note also that Jesus says that there are many, tons of people, stacks of people on this wide road, but comparatively few people on this narrow road. He says beyond that one leads to destruction and one leads to life. The comparisons that Jesus is portraying for us here could not be more stark, and candidly, I don't believe they could be more clear. And let me just paint the picture as clearly as I can for you. At the end of the day, and our culture does not like this, but ultimately there are but two roads that individuals are on. And there is a road that leads to God's presence in heaven, or there is a road that leads to God's absence in a real place called hell. And that's it. There's not different options. There's this road or that road, and that's it. There's only two. And Jesus says that one is a wide road and one is narrow. But he says of the narrow road, he says that this road is difficult. The word that's used there that's translated as difficult conveys the idea of constraining. And by comparison, he says the wide road, he says it's broad. What I want you to understand, and if you've been listening over the past number of weeks, as Jesus has been unpacking what kingdom living looks like, one of the things that you should have realized is this. The whole experience of following Jesus, it is anything other than easy. It just isn't. Because consistently what I'm going to find myself doing is that I'm going to have part of me, this fleshly part of me, that wants to do this. But my king is going to say, I want you to do that. Like fleshly, we will have physical urges, sexual urges that will lead us to go down path A, but our king says, no, that's not how it's to operate. We'll have emotional urges where we want to lash out with anger and wrath, and our king says to go down this road. Over and over and over and over again, Jesus has been saying that kingdom living, the bar is very high. It is not easy, this life that he has called us to. And consistently what you're going to find yourself doing if you are a kingdom citizen is looking in the mirror and telling the person that you see staring back at you, no. No. Because the one that you're following, you're saying yes to. By contrast, Jesus says, though, there's this other path, and there are gobs of people on this path. In fact, if you pay attention to it, look at our culture. There's always been popular roads and popular paths. And our culture says things like this: if it feels good, do it. Do what makes you happy. Follow your gut. Follow your heart. Do whatever you would like. That's the wide road. There are plenty of people on it. Our world in mass is doing this. And Jesus says you can get on that road. There are plenty of people on it. But I'm telling you, this is where it leads. It leads to destruction. By contrast, he says there is this narrow gate, this difficult road, and it leads to life. And by comparison, few people find it. One of the things that he says that we have to pay attention to, though, is that there are only two paths. And many in our culture may find that very limiting and constraining and may find it even offensive. But they may not like that, thinking that you should be able to choose your own path, but only if you're the king. Now, if you're the king, then you can choose your own path. But you're not. And the one who is the king is saying, listen, this is how it is. And if you want to gain entrance into his kingdom, he has described this. He says that I am the door. I am the door. And if you want to experience entrance into my kingdom, you come through me. And it is not an easy path. And following me is not going to be easy. You don't make up the rules. You don't get to decide that you're good enough. In fact, what Paul says in Romans chapter 3, verse 4, let God be true and every man a liar. Again, the king determines the rules of the kingdom. You know, it's an entirely weighty thought, because the question that arises from what Jesus says here is this question. Is it that there are only going to be a comparatively few people, or is it that there are only going to be a few people that are in heaven?
After all, he says, few find it. I mean, is heaven going to be a fairly sparsely populated place? Is it just going to be a few folks and some crickets chirping? I don't believe it is the case that there will be just merely a few people that are there, but I believe it is the case, and Jesus, I think, is seeking to make it as clear as he can. Comparatively, there are going to be significantly fewer people there than should be. Compared to the people who have lived, compared to the people who could have chosen this path, a comparatively small number will have chosen the path that leads to life. When I was in college, I took a year of Greek. In seminary, I had to take another year. And when I was signing up for classes, once I got to seminary, I was just without regard, just kind of signing up for stuff. And I didn't give any consideration as to who may be teaching particular classes. I didn't ask around or ask about any particular professors or anything, saying, hey, is this one good, bad, or the other? I just whatever might work in my schedule. And as I was working with somebody from the registrar's office, they said, oh, this particular Greek class, there's plenty of openings in that one. Let me just go ahead and say, if they say there's plenty of openings in that one, I should have paid attention. Well, there was a good reason there were plenty of openings in that one. It's because the Antichrist was teaching that class. And he really was. He was a brilliant, brilliant man. And but truly, one of the hardest classes I've ever had, one of the most difficult professors I've ever had. And this is no joke. He literally... I remember on exams, he gave an exam back, and somebody said, where is the answer to this question? And he said, it's in the footnote of the workbook, not of the textbook, but of the stupid workbook. We're like, really? You're that guy? But he was that guy. And because he was that guy, you know what? That's why there are all these spaces in his class. Why? Because his class was tough. His class was tough. It was so difficult, and because it was so difficult, that's why people weren't signing up like mad for it. People were signing up for the classes that were easy. Listen, that's what our culture is doing. Our culture operates like electricity, and people and human nature, by just intrinsic human nature, seeks to operate like electricity and to opt for the path of least resistance. And we don't like to be told no. We want to have things our own way. And Jesus has said, listen, I want to be your king. I want to be the one that is calling the shots. I want to be the one that's establishing the patterns and the norms and the standards for your life. And that's going to require you saying no, and me saying no to you, and you accepting that and still following me. And many don't want to hear that. And so they'll say, no, I'm going to get in this other road. And Jesus says, fine. You can get on that road. There are plenty that are on it. That road is wide. It's easy. Oh, it is so easy. You don't have to say no to anything. You can have sex with whomever you want, whenever you want. You can drink whatever you want, whenever you want. You can watch whatever you want, whenever you want. You can ingest whatever you want, whenever you want. It's Katie bar the door. You can live however you want. I'm just telling you, the King said that life that way does not lead to kingdom experience. It leads to destruction. So if you want to experience kingdom living, ask yourself this. Did I use the narrow gate that isn't crowded? The narrow gate that isn't crowded, very simply, is Jesus. It is. It always has been. He said that he is the door. Following him, doing things his way, it will never be popular. It will never be the majority thing. It will never be cool. But it is always the path that leads to life. And unfortunately, and comparatively, few will find it. But he poses another question, and that's this. Are your words and actions joined by obedience? Are your words and actions joined by obedience? Starting in verse 15, Jesus uses another illustration, and he talks about false prophets that are presenting themselves as effectively sheep in wolves in sheep's clothing. And then he talks about trees bearing fruit. And he's saying this: those that are kingdom citizens will bear the fruit of being a kingdom citizen. And that's everything that he's saying in verses 15 through 20. And he fleshes this out more specifically starting in verse 21. And it's kind of concerning, perhaps. And maybe you might find it alarming, because he says this: not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Like when you read that, well, that's kind of bad news, isn't it? Because calling him Lord, that's kind of the right answer, isn't it? I mean, didn't Romans 10:9 say that if you confess with your mouth and believe in your heart that confess him as Lord? I mean, wasn't that kind of an essential? And he says that not everyone who says or confesses him as Lord is going to enter the kingdom of heaven. And then in verse 22, on that day, he says many are not going to confess him Lord, but then they're going to even repeat that phrase, Lord, Lord, and say, didn't we prophesy in your name? Prophesying, that's like preaching. We talked to people about you. And, oh, by the way, we're using that term Lord, which is synonymous with master. So we talked to people about you. We drove out demons. So we did supernatural, charismatic type of demonstrations. We did all this in your name. We did miracles in your name. And then Jesus says, I will announce to them, I don't know who you are. How in the world could this happen? How could it be that you have people that are using a term that's synonymous with master, calling him Lord, and then saying, hey, by the way, we did stuff in your name? And to use modern parlance, we would say that, hey, I taught Bible studies, I led small groups, I went to church, I even preached, I went on mission trips, I did all this stuff, and it had a cross on it. It had I did this. I did all this stuff for you. So surely I'm gaining entrance into the kingdom. Surely I'm getting into heaven. And then you're going to turn around and say to me, "Depart from me, I never knew you." How in the world is that possible? On what basis might that happen? Notice how Jesus responds in verse 21. He says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven." He says, "But only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven." That's the same type of response that you see at the end of verse 23, where he says, "Depart from me, you lawbreakers." Let me just cut to the chase and say very simply that this is what Jesus is looking for. He is looking for obedience. He always has been looking for obedience. And it is not that my obedience saves me, but it is that my obedience demonstrates that I'm a kingdom citizen. If I lean on and lean into Christ based on what he has done for me, and I say, I want you to be my king, and I want to follow you, and I want to do things your way, and I am trusting in you, and I'm going to follow you, if I actually mean that, I am going to do what he says. Jesus describes, though, individuals who say, oh no, we're kingdom citizens and we do stuff. We talk about you, we mention you, we accomplish feats and we put your name on it. But when push comes to shove, we don't actually do what you say. And Jesus says, that's a person that doesn't know me, and that's someone I do not know. At the end of the day, the surest test of being a kingdom citizen is this: do you do what the king says? You know, so many times, unfortunately, I believe it is the case that the American church has drank the Kool-Aid of American culture, where it is that we equate success and growth, or we equate growth with success. And so we think if something is growing, well, then that's spot on. If something is growing, then that means that God is in it. And here you've got individuals saying, hey, we did all of this stuff, so that clearly means that God is in this. Clearly, we are connected with God because of this, but there are plenty of things that grow that aren't good, right? Cancer grows, but it's not good, right? But here you have these individuals saying, hey, we did all of these things, and we had your name on it. We were doing these things in your name, but Jesus said, I never knew you. The surest test is this: do I actually do what he says? Do I actually do what he says? Listen, God's not looking for me to be a miracle worker. He's looking for me to be a kingdom citizen who does what the king says. It's that simple. Maybe it is that you have struggled at various points, or maybe even struggling today, wondering, I'm not exactly sure whether or not I have this relationship with God. Let me ask you two things. Would you say that your life lines up more with the crowd, the wide road, or the narrow road? Are you doing stuff and putting Jesus' name on it, or are you doing the things that Jesus said? Those are two wonderfully clear indicators to answer the question whether or not you're one of his kingdom citizens. I think I might have even shared this with you before, but I remember, and this memory is very clear in my mind, though, when Nathan was a little guy, taking him to the park one summer night. We had stopped at a Burger King. After we left, it was just stifling hot, and they had ices. I don't know if they still have them, but and I don't even know if they still do this, but you can get one of the paper crowns. I think that's what they make their chicken nuggets out of, too. But anyway, he'd gotten one of those, and we're sitting there. He's got that crown on his head, and for some reason I took it off, and I put it on my head. And he said, no, Daddy, you not king. And he put the crown back on his head. And that's always kind of stuck with me, and stuck with me in my relationship with God. And it is that Christ is to have the crown and never me, because he's in charge and I am not, if indeed I'm a kingdom citizen. Will you bow your heads with me?